it's my pleasure. It's always nice to meet people on campus who are doing this kind of work. And as you mentioned, it's small, but it's growing. And so it's good to know who's involved in what spheres and get a sense of how we might collaborate over time. Because that to me is the real strength. And cybercrime and cybersecurity can be inherently tremendously interdisciplinary, but it's just a matter of finding that kind of common language, the points of intersection, and then building from there. And so there's a variety of ways to get to that. But one of the easiest ways is to know who's exactly doing what kinds of pillars of research. So what I have for you today is somewhat introductory, but I'll try to talk in a few different points about some specifics that we've done in the past. But the focus is just looking at the issue of cybercrime, offending, and victimization. And in general, a lot of criminological work tends to focus on the usual offenses you might expect: robbery, burglary, serious forms of crime, and a tremendous focus on real-world risk factors. So traditionally, evidence suggests that the factors that are associated with criminal behavior tend to be having peers who engage in crime or delinquency. And most specifically, if we're interested in understanding who's likely to engage in serious crimes, there's a trajectory, there's a sort of buildup, there's an escalation and then an increase over time in terms of both offending severity and offending frequency. And one of the key predictors for that is early identification of peers who are engaged in delinquent or high-risk behavior. In addition to that, having attitudes that are supportive of offending generally, whether it's a perception that crime is acceptable, that there's no harm in doing X or Y, all of those things as they build increase an individual's willingness to engage in crime, because there's a perception that either there is no harm that results, so the harm that is caused is a direct result of someone else's behavior, or there are ways to neutralize or justifying activity. In the last 30 years, there's been an increased focus on what's referred to as low self-control. Psychology may refer to this as impulsivity. For criminological research, it's a cluster of behavioral and attitudinal measures that we define as low self-control. And I'll talk more about what that means specifically in just a minute. In addition to that, there are traditional demographic factors that are associated: age, race, and socioeconomic status. There's a tremendous amount of connection between living in poverty and the risk of crime. Race, there is a high correlation between being African American or Latino, at least in the US, and engaging in crime. And there's an age correlate as well. We see the majority of offending around the ages of 13 to 18, with a peak between 18 to 20 or 18 to 21, just depending on the years that we're looking at, and then a subsequent decline. And those connections are very, very important because there's a key link between offending and victimization. Offenders look like victims, victims look like offenders in terms of demographic background and behavior patterns. There are certain activities that people engage in that arguably expose them to risk factors for victimization. Being in areas where there's a high crime rate disproportionately enhances your exposure to motivated offenders, puts you in direct proximity to people who are willing to engage in crime. And so therefore you become a potential target. In addition to that, time spent in certain places, more time spent at bars, for instance, increases risk due to proximity to people who are drinking or who are potentially using drugs, which are inhibiting or disinhibiting and therefore increase risk. In addition to that, individuals who have delinquent peers tend to be targeted for victimization by those friends. And so there's a connection between who you know and your own risk of victimization. There's also, in the last 10 years, been a recognition that individuals with low self-control, this kind of cluster of behavioral and attitudinal factors, tend to have a higher risk of victimization. And I'll talk about why in just a second. Knowing that there is this association, however, between victims and offenders is very important because it gets us to a better point of understanding why and how certain people are disproportionately likely to experience both crime and victimization. This idea of low self-control came about in the very early 1990s. Gottfredson and Hershey, two very well-known criminologists, posed an idea that crime as we know it is very, very simple. And most offenses can be accounted for through a simple idea, which is self-control. They argue that self-control is a behavioral and attitudinal factor formed by parents in early adolescence, and there's been some research to suggest it can progress from there into the teens, but it becomes a relatively fixed thing after a certain point in time. And parents who are ineffective at socializing their kids are more likely to produce youth with low self-control. So parents who fail to recognize delinquent behavior, fail to punish it, and fail to monitor behavior regularly are more likely to produce kids with low self-control. And that tends to be measured by the factors identified here. Individuals with low self-control are impulsive, they're short-sighted, they're insensitive generally to the feelings of others, they're physical rather than verbal, so in any given situation they may be more likely to act rather than think about their behavior first. There's also an orientation toward immediate gratification, and that's where the idea of crime becomes very, very salient, because someone who is just thinking about immediate reward may find the idea of theft or of robbery as an easier mechanism to obtain whatever it is that you need, rather than working or trying to get a legitimate job and take the traditional path toward those goals. And then finally, risk-taking. And risk-taking behavior can be everything from smoking and drinking at an early age to risky sexual practices, driving without a seatbelt. There's a locus of things that are factored in here. So knowing that, there's this association between low self-control and criminality and victimization. There's been a lot of research in the last decade, and I say decade because this is very important. Criminologists relatively ignored the problem of cybercrime until around 2001, 2002, and most of that work at the time was being driven by David Wall and Peter Grabowski, so an Australian researcher and a UK researcher. And the body of work grew from there. The empirical literature around cybercrime testing ideas of theory and their application really only came about around 2004 and 5, and you can identify the key researchers working in that space. And in general, the evidence suggests that there is a connection between low self-control and cybercrime, much like there is between low self-control and traditional offenses. Largely because with online crime there are things that provide immediate reward. With digital piracy, for instance, the acquisition of software or media is very easy. In fact, with piracy, really we're the only people who constrain the risk of engaging in piracy. Same with online pornography, and there's some mixed research with respect to its application for computer hacking. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that may be the case later. But generally, there's this association between low self-control and certain forms of cybercrime. What we don't know necessarily is the extent to which peer associations are affecting low self-control and involvement in cybercrime. Cybercrime is technically different from real-world offending in that there is a certain degree of technical knowledge that has to be applied first, whereas with theft or with certain forms of burglary and robbery, it can be relatively simple and you don't need much by way of imitation in order to act. Whereas with cybercrime, you have to know, how do I download a torrent? How do I make this program work? How do I do something effectively? So there is some difference there. What we've tried to do, myself and some colleagues, is look at the issue of low self-control and its application to both offending and victimization in depth using different data sets. So what I'll talk about first is some research that we've done with a population of middle school and high school students from Kentucky. We collected this data back in 2008, and we've published a few studies out of it over the last few years. This is a paper that came out in 2012 looking at the relationship between low self-control, peer associations, and involvement in multiple forms of cybercrime offending. So using 435 kids out of our entire data set, we asked how many times in the last 12 months have you made, used, or gave to someone else pirated software, pirated media, gone to a website to view sexual materials on purpose, posted a mean or threatening message about someone else for them to see, and then finally accessed another's computer account or files without their permission. So this minor form of hacking is something that we wanted to include because we thought there may be some differences potentially between low self-control and hacking relative to all other crimes. It's not necessarily hard to get access to someone's computer, but there are different ways to do it. So you could guess someone's password, you may know their password already and just use it to get in, but there is some difference in how you might go about this. We unfortunately couldn't get into any greater depth with that measure than what we have here, but this is at least a starting point to examine some differences. From there we looked at as independent variables computer skill, so how well can you use a computer? We had a 4-item measure for that. Where is the computer located in the home? Trying to assess whether a publicly placed computer, say in a kitchen or a living room, may have some difference rather than kids who have access to a computer in their bedroom or someplace private. The number of times that they're online for non-school related activity in terms of hours, Then low self-control. And this is a 24-item measure. It's a very large scale, but it's got tremendous reliability, and it's well tested across multiple studies over time. And then peer deviance. So we included a measure for how many of your friends engage in whichever behavior we were looking at here. So that includes the value of piracy in its various forms, viewing porn, and trying to gain access to other people's computers. And then we have 3 demographic variables, so sex, age, and report card grades. And the age measure here is a proxy based on their grade in school. So what year are you in your middle school or your high school? So this first model combines the behaviors generally. So we see the model for all forms of cybercrime here in Model 1. So we include low self-control by itself first, and you can see it is significant. So there is a direct relationship between low self-control and cybercrime. The more time that they're online for non-school related purposes is also significant, as is computer skill. The greater the degree of skill, the more likely they are to engage in cybercrime. Computer location also matters. Those who have a private location are able to do more. We also saw a relationship to gender, so males are more likely to engage in these behaviors, which is relatively consistent with existing research. Arguably, now that technology use has flattened to a certain extent, there is no longer that very, very gendered dynamic in technology, but there does appear to be some distinction between males and females in their involvement. Age also matters. Older kids can do more, and report card grades, those who are doing poorly are more likely to engage in cybercrime. And when we included the peer measure, something very interesting happens. A lot of our other significant variables drop out. And so having delinquent peers becomes a very strong predictor of involvement in cybercrime. Computer location still matters, as does gender, but everything else disappears, which suggests peers are a very, very important factor that we can't ignore when it comes to the problem of cybercrime. We then parsed out the model into each specific form to see if there are differences in terms of one form of cybercrime over another. And you can see that low self-control remains significant across all of these behaviors, as does peer involvement. So it's very important to recognize it's not only the youth, but who they associate with that matters. But there are some differences here too. Computer skill is associated with software piracy, which does make a certain degree of sense. With software piracy, there are some more technical things that a person has to do, like get a key for the software itself or use a key generator in order to use it. And report card grades, kids who got better grades are more likely to pirate software, which was a little opposite in what we were traditionally thinking there. Gender is significant for software piracy, for viewing porn, and so males are more likely to do both of those behaviors, but we see that females are more likely to engage in online harassment, that posting messages for people to see. That sticks a little more closely to what we've seen with respect to harassment literature generally. It seems as though girls are more likely to engage in cyber harassment or cyberbullying than males. And there is a difference between males and females in terms of traditional bullying. We see that boys are more likely to engage in physical contact bullying, say hitting another kid, saying mean things, other forms of behavior. When it comes to the hacking item, interestingly, it's only low self-control and peers. None of the other factors are significant, not computer skill, not anything else. And this is something we're trying to look at a little more intensely with some different measures to try to see what other factors may be significant here. But taking all that into account, some of the implications are relatively straightforward. Peers are a salient predictor of cybercrime. We have to know who it is that kids are associating with, because that's going to differentially increase risk, as does low self-control. But that gender dynamic is something that's very important. We do need to consider differences in offending. When we look at traditional crimes overall, we see that males are more likely to engage in physical crimes. The only crime that women engage in at a higher rate tends to be shoplifting or minor theft overall. So there may be some traditional pattern of offending and gender dynamics here. But beyond that, things are a little more complicated. So taking this idea of low self-control as a significant predictor for offending, we've tried to look at its relationship to victimization in some depth. And it's important to recognize why would self-control matter here. In general, youth with low self-control, since they're more likely to engage in offending, are disproportionately going to spend time around those who are more likely to offend as well. So this differentially increases exposure to motivated offenders. That lack of empathy the factors that are associated with an inability to recognize consequences of action also have some relationship here because it tends to reduce the use of protective factors. From a cybercrime perspective, this is particularly important because there appears to be association between low self-control and a lack of security measures. So an inability to appropriately use software like, say, an antivirus program, spam program, things like that. Basic factors that could reduce the risk of malicious software infection. If you're downloading music or movies or pirated media generally at a higher rate, that's also increasing the risk of malicious software infections generally. So there may be some interplay here between low self-control, piracy, and risk of certain forms of cybercrime victimization. The deviant peer factor is also important because it, as I mentioned earlier, kind of indirectly increases risk of exposure to motivated offenders. Knowing all of that, we've tried to look at this issue with a specific focus on our youth sample by looking at sexual victimization. There's been a few studies in the US asking this question of how many times in the last 12 months has somebody tried to get you to talk about sex when you're online when you didn't want to. Usually, this study, which has been conducted by some researchers in New Hampshire, have not taken any steps to try to tease out, is this something that's being driven by strangers or by intimate peers? It's just a general blanket question, what's going on? And the rate for that varies from year to year, but it's gone up in the last 2 waves of the study. So originally it was about 5%, now it's around 12% in the 2010 index of the study. So risk has gone up, so we used their same measure and tried to see what factors are predicting behavior. We segmented it as well into 3 response categories. Kids who've never experienced this, those who've experienced 1 to 2 times, and then 3 or more times, just to look at what factors are affecting risk. And one of the theoretical frameworks we've used for this analysis, the news story that you saw, is a theory called routine activities. Routine activities argues that individuals who are in greater proximity to motivated offenders, who fail to take appropriate steps to guard themselves or protect themselves when they're engaging in any given behavior, and are considered a suitable target for one reason or another. And that could vary depending on the type of offense we're looking at here. With a sexual offense, though, of this kind of nature, there seems to be some relationship between gender and behavior overall that makes someone a more suitable target. And so we tried to apply that framework here in conjunction with low self-control. So we asked some questions like, do you have an online social network profile? So because you're posting information about yourself, that may increase individuals' knowledge of you as a potential target. The time that you spend online, checking email, and chat rooms, and instant messaging can also disproportionately increase exposure to others. Do you chat with people you don't know while you're online? And to what extent do you do that? Do you post pictures of yourself? Do you send pictures of yourself to other people? Do you post personal information when you're online? Do you view sexual materials? Because again, these are all potential risk factors. Where's the computer located in your home? This goes to that question of potential protective factors. So if it's in a public place, it may be easier for parents to observe what's going on or watch your reactions to certain things while you're on the computer itself. Also, we asked about the presence of parental filtering software. Is there anything that technically can keep you from doing certain things online? It's thought that that might have some potential impact on risk of victimization. Then we included self-control and peer deviance. So how many of your friends view sexual materials and how many have tried to get you to talk about sex when you didn't want to? This is important because we're one of the first studies to look at this potential issue of peer influence on risk of victimization. I'll just show you the models here. In our first model, we exclude the peer factors, and you'll see that chat room use is significant, so spending time in chat rooms increases your risk for sexual harassment victimization. Posting pictures of yourself does as well, and being female. So this fits with the general research that's been done, as does low self-control. Youth who are impulsive, short-sighted tend to experience this type of victimization at a higher rate. When we include the peer measure, then the model changes just a little bit. The chat room item disappears completely. Viewing sexual materials becomes significant. So what the individual is doing increases their risk, as does gender. Gender remains significant. And then the peers trying to get you to talk about sex becomes the driving factor in the model. We parsed this by gender as well, just to see what differences may exist between males and females for risk of victimization. And these items highlighted in red I know it says here highlighted in gray, but that's an error just for the purposes of this table, are going to have a significant difference. That means males and females have some difference in the rate of victimization. So for males, the factors that seem to be driving victimization are chatting with people who they don't know, that seems to matter, posting pictures while they're online, and viewing sexual material, or excuse me, having peers who view sexual material. That's significant for girls. So that seems to be the only factor that is substantially different between males and females. For boys, it's chatting with people and posting pictures. For girls, it's viewing sexual material, or having peers who view sexual materials. So that leads us to general implications. For victimization, routine behavior seems to matter. There are a handful of factors that are significant, but the bigger factor is the increased exposure to motivated offenders. So having peers that you know who are engaging in deviance are going to differentially increase your own risk of victimization. Low self-control matters, and importantly, peer behavior plays a critical role, but it doesn't mediate the relationship. It doesn't remove the value of low self-control as a potential predictor. So that means we have to think critically about what peers are going to do for your own risk. The problem for this in terms of policy is substantial, though. When we're talking about traditional offending, there are ways that we can mechanically reduce risk of crime. So for instance, having security cameras in a garage can help introduce the potential for surveillance. With computer technology, though, that doesn't seem to matter. Technological barriers like parental filtering software were not significant in this analysis. Across most of the criminological work that's been done, the presence of parental filtering software, antivirus tools, things like that have minimal value. And so there may not be a way to technically mitigate risk for certain forms of cybercrime victimization. And that leads to some challenges when we're thinking about parental involvement. Parents have to know what their kids are doing because that's going to help inform what behaviors they're engaging in and what behaviors they may face a risk for victimization from. But how do you have a parent who may not be technologically savvy communicate factors to their children, understand what tools they're using, what programs they're using, are they on Snapchat, that kind of thing? It may be beyond a parent's understanding or awareness. And so how do we effectively develop a strategy to provide youth understanding of cybersecurity and also inform their parents who may be at a different level of technological capability or sophistication? That's got to be a very important factor in all of this. School education programs can be one way to do that, so introducing training to explain to kids what's acceptable, what's unacceptable behavior, but parents have to be engaged in that in some way. And it begs the question, how much do schools get involved as a sanctioning mechanism? Arguably, with something like cyberbullying, schools have an obligation to protect the kids who are within their school district from bullying on campus. The question has become, how much do they get involved with cyberbullying or cyber harassment? Because if the activity is taking place off of the school campus, but involves students who attend that institution, do they get involved? What do they do? And how much can they sanction youth behavior, whether through school suspensions, detention, or otherwise? This varies from state to state, from school district to school district, and so there is no blanket uniform policy that's been developed yet. And it begs the question, how do we effectively do this? There's minimal research to date that's really tried to address that. And it's a very large question moving forward. What do we do about this? From a criminological perspective, there's a lot more research that needs to be done. In general, there's been about 15 to 20 studies looking at victimization, but we use a lot of inconsistent measures from study to study. So what one research body finds may not be replicable across studies because someone else has used a different type of measure. And we need to understand how much overlap there is. If the factors that predict risk are the same, how much relationship may there be between real-world offending and cybercrime offending generally? So is a kid who's stealing things from a supermarket, are they also engaging in cybercrime? Are serious offenders, in terms of, say, physical violence, robbery, burglary, etc., also engaging in cyber, and to what extent? Is there specialization? Is there segmentation? Is there differentiation? We've got to also better understand this relationship between peers and victimization and crime generally. Most studies just ask, how many of your friends do this? There's no differentiation between friends who you know in person and friends who you know only online, and the extent to which those relationships may vary. So if we better understand how many kids have a social network online that differs from their real world a social network, that's going to be important because these could be some substantial differences that we want to understand further. And then finally, most of the research that's been done uses small samples, like what we have here, this one population from one state. Some places just do college samples, so we have yet to have a good body of research that utilizes a nationwide representative sample. And minimal studies are taking place that actually provide data that we could use for this longitudinally. So there's got to be an expansion in terms of quality of data here too. We'll go ahead and stop there.
Great. In the Oxford Internet Surveys in Britain, and one of the questions was, do you view more immoral material online, or I think, or you use the internet to view immoral material? I think that's somewhat like we worded it, and it's not exact. But nobody, and we found very reasonable findings. For example, the people most likely to say they do are younger boys, okay, rather than older people or women. And but nobody believes nobody believes that people will be honestly answer that. Now maybe, so I think we maybe get at the extreme. In other words, the pattern of relationship gives some validity to that. I think that probably makes sense. But then they think we underestimate that. And I'd be very interested in your marginals in terms of the proportion of people who do all of these things, or say they've been victims, or say they've done these things. Are they what you expect, or they violate your expectations, or having?
Generally, for something like software piracy, it's between 40 and 60% of the population says that they do either media piracy or software piracy, and that's dependent on the college or the middle or high school sample. So that seems to be relatively consistent. You've got a majority of your respondents. With pornography, it varies. It's between 25 and 50, depending on whether we're looking at college or youth samples. In the youth samples, it tends to be a little bit lower, which may be a consequence of a variety of things, but at least at the college level, it tends to be higher, but nobody knows for sure just how representative it is. So it's a tough thing. With victimization, rates are somewhat comparable even internationally with things like bullying and harassment and stalking. Those can vary between 20 to 30% of youth or college-age individuals, depending. For something more serious like cyber stalking, U.S. data suggests that between I think it's 17 to 25% experience it, so it's a little bit lower, and that includes something like the supplemental survey on victimization from the U.S. National Crime Victimization Survey, as well as a multi-college sample that's been done. So that's a little more stable, and some people think that's reliable. But with something like pornography use, yeah, it's very hard to say.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a chance that because we only have this one item, but if you've got a number of really excellent questions that deal with this, but I wonder if you might, did you try to see if they clustered together in some way so that you could have some more general index or factor? Or
we've done that a little bit, and one of the distinctions is that they don't factor together perfectly. You can scale them, but in looking at them a little more with a refined or nuanced kind of perspective, the hacking measures that we include, which can be a little better than just this measure that we included here, we've done it in the past with things like have you guessed someone's password in order to access their account, have you added, deleted, changed things. Those hacking measures tend to fall out if you're trying to create a factored item, and so that would suggest there may be some differentiation. With viewing pornography, that tends to hang together with the piracy measures and with harassment to a certain extent. So those do fit well. Sometimes those hacking items don't play as well. With some college data that we have, we've found that there are differences in predictors for viewing pornography at a higher rate. And there does seem to be consistency between males and females past a certain threshold, which we didn't expect. But beyond that, that's really about the only time that we've seen a kind of surprising difference emerge.
I do have another question, which is so, and then I'll stop and let others. But one of the things that's argued very much in the literature on, say, music piracies, is that there are normative issues as well as. In other words, some people don't think it's wrong to download music. Yeah. And even some people we had one question about the appropriateness of downloading music versus downloading a book or something. And actually even younger people think that it's more appropriate to download music, but downloading a book or something might be a little, that's problematic. So they do have norms about this, and maybe, so it may not be a crime. In other words, if some of these things are not viewed as a criminal by some people. And I don't know how that fits in. Maybe criminals don't think they're really doing anything that wrong anyway. But don't know.
It's a very good point. There have been a number of studies looking at what's referred to as the techniques of neutralization, the ways that individuals justify their activity. With piracy, an individual named Samir Hinduja, who's actually one of our PhD graduates from CJ, has done some really good work in this area. And it seems like there's clustering of these neutralizations depending on the frequency with which a person downloads music. And so people who have a higher acceptance of certain techniques that justify or kind of minimize the perception that they're causing economic harm. So I don't think there's anything wrong because, so what, a musician loses another dollar on how many millions they make. So things like that do seem to matter. The kind of real nuanced things in terms of looking at music versus software versus books or other forms of media now hasn't been done quite as much. So we're still resting on research that's a few years old. The cross-national issue is even harder when we think about places like Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, where there's a greater kind of cultural acceptance of piracy. That may lead to some substantial differences. So we don't know exactly what's going to be the key factor in differentiating a US or a European who's downloading media of different forms versus, say, South America, Africa, and certain parts of Asia. So there do seem to be some differences, especially looking at some of the global surveys on software piracy. It's exponentially higher in Asia, Africa, and certain parts of South America than it is in the US and Europe. So there are some definite cultural differences that come into play.
I mean, the thing that with that regard to look into is compare overall software piracy in Asia versus specifically viewership of pornography in the United States, where traditionally the pornography industry has had much lax intellectual property protection. And all of the same copyrights and everything technically hold, but they're just never enforced. The other interesting thing about actually pornography within your study is that actually there are two laws being broken, right? So most Americans, period, don't realize that they're actually breaking the law if they're viewing free pornography because it's actually just pirated. And but then, of course, the main one that I guess you're probably focusing on is the fact that these are people who are under the age of 18.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the explicit message that they get, that are you over 18 or whatever.
Yeah.
What is the law that's broken?
So there are two laws that are broken. One is kind of explicit, that you're not supposed to view this website unless you're over a certain age. The second law is well, that's the one that people in his study actually observe, right? Because if you enter a pornographic website, the first thing that you're asked is, are you over 18? Or whatever the age is. But the second one is most Americans view pornographic material as free, but it's actually not. It's pirated.
So you think all the free
But
sites
the industry has very, very poor IP enforcement.
The free sites are apparently putting out of business some of the pornography sites, which is nice.
It depends, like some of the free sites, but there are some individuals who may post the content on their own, which is where sort of like a YouTube posting in full movie
that's
the issue,
I suppose that's a good point. But no, there is a lot of interesting IP related issues, but with that, but that's for a different discussion. I don't have a specific question, but any chance I can take a look at your list of dependent variables and maybe while you're talking.
For which one? This one?
So this is the one where the I'm sorry, I meant independent variables.
Mhm.
The dependent is, have you been victimized in the last 12 months?
Right.
And just to ask, this is purely cross-sectional, right? So
Yes.
there's no way to get at, the probability of being victimized probably increases substantially if you had been victimized in the past.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Since this is cross-sectional, we have no way of knowing what could account for repeat victimization over a long period of time. And that's something that people have just begun to research with respect to this low self-control relationship. There's an argument that if you were a victim of one form of crime, your behavior would change over time. So if your home was burglarized, perhaps you'd get a dog, or maybe you'd put in a security system or something like that.
Right.
That as a protective behavior should minimize the risk of future victimization. For some, particularly those with low self-control, there may be an ignorance of behavior change over time. And so for some who experience repeat victimization, it may be a function of their behavioral issues with respect to low self-control, where they don't change that pattern and therefore remain a constant potential victim of crime. So that question of certainty and severity and frequency over time is something that has begun to be addressed by researchers looking longitudinally at traditional physical crime, but less so with cyber because we just don't have the data.
Yeah, I mean, one literature that you might just want to look into, and it's probably not very developed with respect to cybercrime, but is literature on recidivism, because there you actually look at over time.
Yeah, and the recidivism question is an interesting one. There does seem to be this relationship with low self-control up until a certain age where it seems to be just more a function of physically the individual no longer has the capability to offend at the rate that they used to.
Actually, going back one step to previous experience with crime, I did a study this fall on previous experiences and then people's intention to have secure behaviors. And I found that people who had because the initial thing I saw, there were serious things like you were seriously hacked, lost money, that kind of stuff, or minor things like you got a low virus, pop-up ad, email account hack. So I parsed it out into serious and then minor things, and the behaviors were exactly opposite. So people who had a minor thing, like you said, house broken into, you put up the cameras, you do stuff. So the people had a minor thing, upped their virus protection, upped their behaviors. People who had a major occurrence gave up. So it's like, I did all this and I don't know how I got hacked and this person stalked me, and so they just kind of gave up. So I think that might be interesting to delve into more too.
Definitely.
For a time, or what did they say? I quit using computers?
Well, they're still using computers, but they gave up on security protections.
Oh.
They just like, it's going to happen no matter what, you know. So so they're less secure than the ones who had a minor issue and they feel they can overcome it. But when you've been highly violated, they like gave up on security, but they're still doing it. It's like you can't unplug. And then the other thing, I read an article, there was a research in December that about BitTorrent sites and how much downloaded stuff has malware in it. So criminals are using, they know their behavior, they're not secure, and they're using those as portals to multiply the malware and make bots out of their computers and stuff. So these people don't know they have malware, but they probably are loaded with malware.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting too to look at.
Yeah, the handful of studies we've done looking at malicious software infection victimization, piracy is a massive correlate of the risk. So it makes perfect sense. And there's just a handful of criminological studies looking at malicious software generally. It seems like it's not viewed as a problem within our field. It's considered to be a computer science problem. I've had papers rejected outright because they say this is a computer science problem, not a criminological one. So some of it is work that I think has value. It just depends on making it an issue relevant to our specific discipline, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that's where we need the cross-discipline, because it's not just criminological. We need to understand the technical issues and the behavioral issues. And I was thinking, like, you can see the peer effects of bad behavior. Well, what about the peer effects of good behavior? Do we have anything looking at?
Not really.
That's something I'd like to do, is start looking at building communities of
Right.
encouraging social norms that are positive instead of negative.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly it would make sense that individuals are going to acquire definitions about behavior from their peers, but we have not looked at the value of positive or socially supported perspectives. Instead, we've just been looking at the deviant view.
Because we're starting to see that in cyberbullying, because there's a lot of peer pressure now, like this is not acceptable behavior, but we haven't done that in security. Like this is stupid to have a password that's password. Things like that.
So looking at your list of independent, just I don't see any, say reverse causality problems. The one thing I might advise is that some of your variables are likely highly collinear, and in particular I would suggest getting rid of either maintaining online social network profile or the combination of posting personal information online and posting pictures of yourself online, because those are actually, can I see the next slide? I want to see if there's any wait, I can't see, so because they're not significant, right? Yeah, and so that might be the reason.
We've checked in our models for multilinearity. We had no issues there, and our VS and tolerance were all in relatively good ranges. So you're correct that there is some correlation between those activities, but it doesn't appear to be so substantial that it's messing the model variables up.
Okay.
I actually had a question. Could you go to the slide? I don't remember which one it was, where you looked at the different types of cybercrimes.
This one.
That one, yeah. So that I found extremely interesting because software piracy was the only one where skills were significant. And that's really interesting. And that I want to connect that to the last point you made, that we don't really know the relationship between cybercrime and offline crime. Because one of the things that we always heard when we were in the prisons talking about internet access was, oh, they're going to hack their way into the system even if it's secure. And we kept thinking, but the skills are probably, first of all, not there at all. And if they are, they're quite limited. So do you know of any literature that's addressed this before, or?
Not with good granularity to really get into what skill translates into. Our measure was extremely simple. Essentially, I can fix my computer, I can do this. Our most advanced level was I can use Linux, I can fix virtually any problem I have, and I'm very comfortable using the internet. So for those with high skill, I guess that makes a certain degree of sense. But we have only in the last couple of years come up with more refined measures to actually tease out what skill means, like in terms of being able to add certain pieces of hardware, certain pieces of software, configuring a wireless network, where that actually translates into something tangible with respect to skill. There's been a little bit of research, and I mean just a very small amount, by some people at Arizona State looking at the use of technology by gang members. And so this was a study looking at, it was funded by Google, just basically trying to assess how current and former individuals who were involved in a gang, maybe who had been incarcerated, are using technology to the extent that they're on Facebook. If they're on Facebook, how are they using it? Trying to understand a little bit about basic technological distribution of skill and knowledge. That's Decker, Pyrus, and Mole, or M-O-U-L-E. And they found that people who were incarcerated and released didn't have the same degree of technological understanding that current gang members have. But among those current gang members, they're mostly using the internet as a means to post pictures of themselves, do very basic things. They're not promoting or broadcasting any kind of cyber attack capability. Instead, it's mostly just posting a video of themselves and their friends, or posting pictures of themselves, making threats, but virtually little else in that vein. So it is a good question. My assumption would be, yeah, there's probably a very small proportion of individuals with enough skill to actually do anything. But I guess it's a valid kind of fear, but one that's, how would you actually understand it without surveying the prison population? And to date, I'm not aware of anything that's actually tried to do that. But that would be a great thing to know. that begs a very interesting point. I would love to find a way to, in the US, maybe even just using Michigan as an example, understand what full proportion of the prison population has been incarcerated for a cybercrime or for a technologically facilitated offense versus all others, because it's probably a very, very small percentage of a percent.
I have a question, sort of following up from Bruce, but it's not a question, it's just bouncing off of what you're talking about. As you were speaking, I was thinking of to what degree some of your findings fit or clash with conventional wisdom about crime generally. For example, a normal crime or normal concerns with children, we have these conventional wisdoms like don't talk to strangers, don't accept a ride with people, even with friends, what kind of thing. Be careful who you hang. I don't know what is the saying about hanging out with a good your peer group. There must be a saying. Well, yeah, maybe birds of. But if we could translate, well, first of all, if we could identify ways in which online situations somehow differ from what we think is conventional wisdom, or if it conforms with conventional wisdom. I mean, I think a lot of people think they can't understand how to deal with cybercrime because it may be too technical or too. But as you just said, I mean, the internet has pretty much democratized crime, and so it is also, maybe there's ways, and if we could, the intelligence of conventional wisdom is it creates these simple ideas or simple rules, or that maybe we need that kind of wisdom in the internet arena. Maybe we already do. I mean, people do say, well, I don't know, maybe do we? Or because parents don't understand things like change your profile or your some kind of your passwords or your privacy settings. Okay, what does that mean? You know, for many parents. And
I would say a lot of the conventional understanding with respect to traditional crime applies here. It is just an extension of the real world environment. While certainly there are mediums and platforms that are unique, the general role of friends and of situational factors are important. So it's understanding who your friends are, which are going to disproportionately increase risk of victimization and offending, that are going to have the greatest influence. So it's much the same with respect to traditional crime. Communicating that is probably the harder part because many people may just assume it's so distinct, it's so different that it's not equivalent. But what you do when you're online does matter. Spending time in certain environments, talking to certain people does have an association here. It's only different with respect to malicious software where there's a substantial difference from the norm. In that respect, it's almost more like traditional models of epidemiology, where spread could come from a variety of different factors. Otherwise, our traditional theories of crime seem to work pretty well in a virtual environment. So I think the notion that cybercrime is separate from traditional crime needs to be broken down and almost removed. The only time that evidence has suggested something to the contrary is with respect to self-control and serious forms of computer hacking. That makes intuitive sense because if you're, say, developing a piece of malicious software, that takes a much higher degree of patience, of technical competency and understanding that a person with low self-control wouldn't necessarily have the ability to sit down and program for hours and hours to make something happen. So that's about the only time where we've seen this model fail, is in more serious forms of computer hacking as a predictor. Otherwise, social learning, self-control, these are all about the same. So I think it's valuable because that tells us cybercrime is not this totally distinct animal, it's just an extension of offending.
But, well, I don't know if this is an exception, but maybe a problem with that is that, say, on the internet, people are, children too, are more likely to meet somebody that is not in their neighborhood or in their school. And that's positive. You might meet people who are also interested in chess or interested in science fiction, or and that it broadens your social network. And so if we use the aphorism, or the don't talk to strangers online, well, you sort of undercut potentially a valuable role of the internet in broadening one, instead of hanging out with bad peers, perhaps. In fact, we found that people more likely to use online dating sites and so forth are often from lower income neighborhoods and distressed areas.
Mhm.
They may want to get out of their neighborhood and expand. Anyway, throw that out. I mean, in a way, some of the things we might do to protect ourselves might also undermine some of the virtues of the internet.
And that's a good point. There's not quite as much research understanding what factors are associated with grooming or with that stranger risk of victimization. So that is one area that needs a little bit more information. But writ large, yeah, certainly social network formation is a positive in online environments. Yeah.
Anyway, but it is a real dilemma.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. This was really a packed, very informative talk and really stimulating. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you liked this, we're holding a conference on March 17th. This is the Interdisciplinary Conference on Cybercrime. So we'll have a lot of presentations like this. We'll have some very technical ones. The individual who I was talking about earlier from Arizona State will be here. They're doing some new research looking at body camera and citizen interactions and how technology's potentially affecting that kind of social interaction. So it'll be a good day for technical as well as social presentations on cybercrime.